anthropologists study something called liminal stages. It's the difference is when one era of culture begins to end and before another one begins. There's often a period of transition. And throughout history, whenever these periods have arrived, there are periods that are notable for all the norms being inverted. Everything that's true becomes false, and so on. It's really interesting if you look across the West right now. All the things we believed in have been inverted. We used to believe experts are now derided. Trump was a bit of a clown character. Now he's, probably two-time US president. If we, J.K. Rowling used to be one of the most loved Brits. Now she's probably the most hated. It used to be that in the 1980s, it was the left and Noam Chomsky writing books like Manufacturing Consent, saying the media is manipulated. It's corporate media that manufactures consent. Now the left are likely to be defending the corporate media and saying the New York Times reports the facts, and it's the right saying it's all fake news. So everything's flipped around. All I can say is for sure is it's clear to me that one era of American culture is ending. There will be a new one that emerges. There's probably going to be some sort of cataclysm in between. But the truth is we can't know what it's going to be. But all we know is the usual sources of power and influence and authority will be completely different.
Welcome to the Conciliators Guild podcast. Today we have with us Dr. Calum Nicholson, who's Director of Research at the Danube Institute in Budapest. Calum is also a graduate of both Cambridge and Oxford, a specialist in climate migration, as well as in social media and the significance of social media. Calum, welcome. We're very glad to have you here on the Conciliators Guild podcast. You have some very interesting views about the role of, let me call it, technocratic outlooks, especially from the West towards the rest of the world. Some views about pluralism that we want to get into. Your way of thinking is that there's the outlooks of people towards the rest of the world maybe need to be examined to start there. Tell us a bit more about what you've seen in places like Afghanistan and how the West has engaged in Afghanistan and what that's meant to you, and what did you observe about the nature of that engagement that we should note?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, John. It's great to be on the podcast. Thank you for the invitation. I think there's when people look at Afghanistan and you look at the interventions that have happened over the last 20 odd years, what I see as a pattern, and the way I try and describe this is through an analogy. So most people are familiar that in, I think, the 1890s, there was this fake language or this artificial language, Esperanto, and it was made up in order to provide a neutral language, which was easy to learn, that everyone could learn, and that could become the governing language that would level the playing field, because it's not a native language to anyone, therefore giving no one the advantage, but also it's seen as relatively simple. And the idea was if we all adopted Esperanto, the world would run better. Now, that's 130 years ago. Today, there's maybe 100 or 200,000 speakers of Esperanto, and they speak it as an eccentricity or a hobby. But it never caught on as an actual universal language. But when I saw what happened in Afghanistan with the international intervention, I have to say I look at it as, or I call it political economic Esperanto, because so much about the interventions there wasn't actually us trying to turn fragile states into ourselves. It was rather us trying to impose on these countries or suggest to these countries with certain incentives that they should adopt a type of political economy that in some sense doesn't exist anywhere. It doesn't exist in America, it doesn't exist in Britain or Sweden or anywhere. This ideal type of a sort of a political economy with good governance, the rule of law, gender equity, all the buzzwords of today, all the technocratic shibboleths of today, all in a constellation of how things should be, how it ought to be. And the problem is, much like the language Esperanto, is because it wasn't grown out of the actual native soil of that culture, because in some sense it existed in opposition to that culture, it obviously never really grew very deep roots. And of course, when the Americans left, then the entire edifice of that then disappeared almost overnight. It was gone almost instantly. The Taliban returned. It was interesting, a few months after, about a month or two after the collapse of Afghanistan and after the Americans left, I actually met with, or I had a meeting where I was introduced to a number of people who run the Kurdish government in northern Iraq. some of the sheikhs and the generals who were invited to Hungary, and I met them in Hungary. And I was asking them, and I had a chance to ask them some questions. And I said, in the West, we were very surprised at the collapse of Afghanistan. I said, were you surprised? And they all said no. And I think the reason they said no was because they understood that what was being imposed on them was very alien and artificial. But in a sense, the other way to describe this is what we tried to do was introduce to Afghanistan a kind of, well, we treated democracy almost like IKEA furniture, something we could flat pack and export and mass produce and give to everyone. And I think often this just doesn't work because, I mean, it's everything has its, there is no such thing as a culture that doesn't grow or bloom out of the soil of sedimented history of a particular place. And we tend to think that sometimes in the West we've evolved things that can just be transplanted. But, I think when we think of cultures, in some senses, another analogy we could use, they are quite similar to gardens. They grow in the sedimented soil of their own history. They bloom for a while, they decay, they wither, they turn back into the soil from which the new bloom comes. And I think that this is what happened in Afghanistan, is that we failed to really understand what we were doing. We thought that building a state was a mechanical exercise, when actually, in a sense, it's an organic one.
Calum, I'm actually very curious about what you said about 5 minutes ago, that it's not just duplicating what's in the West, it's actually something that doesn't exist anywhere. Can you just elaborate a bit more on that exact point?
Yeah, and I should also apologize for sounding like I mixed my metaphors before, but perhaps I got carried away. But I do think, yeah, if you look at the idea of saying that what we were trying to build in Afghanistan, this perfect state in a sense, this almost utopian exercise of building a state, the reason it doesn't apply in anywhere else in the world is that in America, in Britain, we know that we can't simply dismiss our history and start again. We know we have to live with the world we've got, with some of the eccentricities of our political systems. They may not be perfect, but they are what we have. I was recently at a debate in Brussels over, is the nation state good or bad? Are borders good or bad? And my argument was simply, borders matter because it's what we have. It's not because they're good or bad. It's just what we're given. But no one's good. There's no one with the Archimedean position from which to say, right, we start again. There's no one refereeing the discussion. We were all part of the game in a sense. So we can't really rewrite the rules like that, not without some massive revolution, which tends to cause more problems than anything else. The problem with Afghanistan is we looked at it and we kind of assumed that they weren't like us, that their history wasn't part of it. And probably because the people with the power and the money were outsiders, were Westerners going in, and they were precisely people to whom the history did not matter. So they felt or did not mean something that they did not live in. And so it's easy to dismiss it. But we wouldn't do that to our own culture. And this is why I think it doesn't exist in the West, because this idea of beginning from an abstract ought, how the world ought to be, is a luxury only of people who are not part of the is of whatever they're looking at. It's easy to look at Afghanistan and say it's not as it ought to be. But you need to begin from how it is. There's a writer called Rory Stewart who he's a podcaster now as well, but he used to talk a lot about Afghanistan, and he had this wonderful line about it. He said, "Ought does not imply can. Just because we think we ought to do something doesn't mean we can in fact do it." And that was a big failing in Afghanistan, is we didn't consider the can. But ultimately, I think what we tried to build there was assuming a tabula rasa, like a blank slate on which we could build something. It was not, in fact, a blank slate. It simply seemed that way to us, perhaps, because we didn't have any understanding of what, in fact, was the case in Afghanistan.
Well, it's interesting, because I work in international relations, I can definitely directly relate to what you're saying. And what I've also noted, which weaves right in to what you're saying, I think, is that once Western countries engage with a non-Western country, especially in a situation of crisis like Afghanistan, they feel that they have to do something. That's the ought that you're referring to. That cascades into a decision to do something quickly. So that, for example, time is not given and time is needed to understand better what to do in that country. So what's also kicking in, I think, is the need for bureaucracies and policymakers to simply attend to doing something quickly, not just for appearance, but that's the nature of these institutions. Never mind the consequences. So I can kind of vouch directly for what you've seen. or yourself in my own work, and it's fairly consistent. Do you think there's any way out of this trap? I mean, bureaucracies and institutions are notoriously difficult to change. Have you had any ideas or thoughts about how we can do things differently?
Well, I'll refer back to on that to Rory Stewart, who I mentioned before. He had a great line about Afghanistan. He said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but basically this is what he said. He wrote that in order to understand the failure of interventions in Afghanistan, we need less an anthropology of Afghanistan. We rather need an anthropology of ourselves to understand our own manias, our own hubrises. I do think one of the problems the West has right now is we have an epidemic of hubris across all areas of society, both ends of the spectrum of politics, the polarized politics we have. The real problem, if you look at the structure of it and you strip away the content of the given issue about which we're arguing, is hubris everywhere. There's the assumption of really three things: that answers exist, that we can find them, and that once found, we can act upon them for the greater good. And of course, the answers we find will reflect their own particular preoccupations in politics. But the other side think the opposite, right? They think we look at the opposition and we say they're the disease and we're the cure, and they look at us and say you're the disease, I'm the cure. You know, it's the same thing. And it's so I think we have a failure to really diagnose our problems properly. And if you look at this idea of an anthropology of ourselves, I think we're failing to see how hubristic a lot of our positions are. And this comes back to the point about the Esperanto or the IKEA approach to Afghanistan. The problem I think the West has, and what's been driving interventions in places like Afghanistan and drove the impulse to do so and the imperative of fixing these sorts of places, and presuming we have the answers with which to fix them, is the basic problem is this assumption that we in the West were not simply people who were beneficiaries of good fortune, chance, and so on, of history, the vicissitudes of fortune falling in our favor, but rather that actually we had the best theory. And so in a sense, every culture, it seems, that has some sort of success, tries to explain to itself how it achieved that. It creates its own mythology. And to some extent, I feel what happened in Afghanistan is us looking at our past and trying to explain it in a theory. And having explained it in a theory to ourselves, we try and prove the validity of that theory by applying it somewhere else. So to some extent, the intervention in Afghanistan isn't even about Afghanistan. It's the way the West tells itself that it's okay. Because to some extent, if you presume yourself to be in a position to develop someone else, it implies you are developed, that you're not the one with the problem. And it's kind of like, by an analogy, I love analogies, but it's kind of an analogy. I've noticed in life that whenever I know someone who's gone through a bit of a personal crisis and perhaps has got into therapy, what they often are at the period where they're most in therapy and at their most vulnerable, but they're desperately trying to prove to themselves that they are healing, they will at that point become evangelicals for therapy to everyone they know. Because there's kind of a presumption, it seems to me, at a psychological level, that if we're helping other people, we must be okay. And I kind of feel the West is doing this a lot, that we help others to presume that we're okay. And so that's kind of the problem in this, is that we think we got where we were because we were smarter. But actually, if you look at British history, for instance, the big problem, the reality is we were quite lucky. From Agincourt to the Armada, from Trafalgar to Waterloo, World War I to World War II, Britain has benefited from being an island, from bad weather getting the Spanish, but consistently being an island has helped us, and among other things. And it's not necessarily a generalizable situation to other countries.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to something that we often all forget, which is the number of variables that go into any one event is something that our minds can't get around. So we tell ourselves stories in a way
Exactly.
to make them make sense. But I wanted to go back to your point about hubris. I certainly see that in international relations, where I do most of my work. There's definitely there. It might be changing, but it's there. But how do you reconcile that with also a trend now at least 10 years old of a kind of self-flagellation in the West? I mean, we see a lot of Westerners almost taking one strand of our history, of Western history, for example, the colonial strand, which is real and was vicious in many ways, but then almost only looking at that in a form of self-flagellation. How do you reconcile that hubris with this desire to almost rewrite Western history and to simplify it, actually, maybe is a better word.
Well, to be quite honest, I think those approaches you're talking about are themselves forms of hubris. There's no humility in that. There's a presumption that we know. And this is the problem we find across the political spectrum. There's a presumption people have that they have the answers, that they are the ones we've been waiting for who understand. It doesn't matter if they're left or right or what they believe. The one thing that everyone has in common is everyone is so sure of themselves. Where is the humility to show some doubt? And this is the thing I find very concerning, that there's a real lack of humility around our own relationship to the world, our own relationship to knowledge. There's a presumption we know everything. But actually, if you look at the 20th century was an interesting century because so much of the advancements we made were founded in a form of humility. The concept of falsification in science, which emerged in the 20th century, Karl Popper's ideas, if you think about it, it's very much it's based in humility. It's saying that the standard of a scientific claim is not that you can prove it true, it's that you could prove it false if it is false. So science never gets more true, it just gets less false. So it's not a positive methodology or philosophy of science, it's by negation. And if you look at a lot of the things we did, even democracy is based on this. Democracy isn't really the power to vote someone in, it's the power to vote someone out. It's not to prove power true, it's to falsify power or false power. And this is, again, it's interesting, Popper did both. He created a falsification model in science and also actually in the social sciences, if you think about it. So I think a lot of these advances we made were around these sorts of issues. In the 20th century, another area within philosophy of science, what developed was a very nuanced debate around scientism. That is the situation where we think science isn't just a guide to the facts, but where we think science is the guide to our values as well. And there were many warnings against the danger of assuming scientists can guide us on our values, not just our facts. But what's interesting in the 21st century, we seem to have forgotten all of these lessons. Everyone is forgetting that they think the power is to vote someone in, not to vote someone out. And we want our guy in power, whatever the side is. With science or even with claims to knowledge in general, you have everyone declaring that they alone have the truth. Indeed, it might just be my truth instead of my opinion. And even with science itself, there's an assumption increasingly, if you look at what's happening with COVID and climate and so on, there's a presumption that science isn't just a guide to the facts, but also a guide to our values. If you look at what happened in the pandemic, for instance, you often heard governments saying our policies are guided by the science. But of course, most of the questions surrounding COVID were not strictly questions that science could answer. Questions, to quote Jonathan Sumption, like, is there more to life than the avoidance of death? Is not a scientific question. It's an inherently subjective, not objective question. It's to do with culture and politics and values and how we assess risk, which is subjective. It's not about the scientific facts as such. And so we seem to be forgetting all the things we learned in the 20th century are all being somehow ironed out of the culture right now. And I think that's one of the broader patterns we face around this hubris. So I'd argue that when you see some of these orthodoxies now coming through of people assuming that they know the truth of the past, or indeed that they're even in a position to draw a moral conclusion about the past. I mean, it's crazy when we look at colonialism. Colonialism happened. But the notion that the object now is to decide whether it was good or bad, for me, is not so much wrong as just nonsensical, because the past is simply the past. It's not a normative issue. It simply is what it was. And we need to make the best of what we have now and for the future. Relitigating everything is a performative exercise. And there's a hubris in that because it presumes if you're performing it, well, you're wanting to look right. And there's a hubris in that. Where's the humility simply to listen and learn rather than just to state and to declare? And so this is why I think when you look at these orthodoxies, I don't think they're humble at all. I think they're very hubristic.
Well, that's actually a nice segue to another issue that I'd like to discuss with you. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're a fan of pluralism. Now, that's an abstract word. So the first question is, of course, would love to know what you mean by pluralism. Because I'm asking because I'm Canadian and it's easy, for example, to say that Canada is a pluralistic society in some ways. Many ethnicities live there in relative peace and stability. Is that pluralism? Do you mean something else? Is there a deeper understanding of pluralism? Because as a premise, it is fundamentally a good entry point to an antidote. to what you've just said, actually. So why are you concerned with pluralism, and what do you mean by it?
Well, I mean, so there's a philosopher called Isaiah Berlin, who is a political philosopher based out of Oxford. And he died in 1998, I think, or 1997, born in, I think, 1908, maybe. And Isaiah Berlin was fascinating, and he had one central claim to his political philosophy. He said the world is objectively plural. And basically, until Isaiah Berlin, political philosophy had been about people trying to determine what is the right way to live and what is the single idea that's the best. And everyone was debating this for 2,000 years, basically. Berlin kind of inverted the whole thing because he said, actually, we need to accept. He said political philosophy isn't about deciding what is the best way to live. It's just simply accepting as an objective starting point that the world is plural, meaning that you and I will see the world slightly differently by dint of simply being different people. And indeed, you know, just unto ourselves, we will see the world differently. I mean, like I always say, you know, I see the world differently depending on how many cups of tea I've had throughout the day. You know, and that's not a fault, it's a feature of being human. We are objectively plural. And I think Shakespeare has a line about all clocks everywhere. Well, I can't remember what it is now, but it's something like everyone's clock moves at a different speed or something. I can't remember what it is now, but it's but everyone believes their own clock in a sense. So this idea of pluralism is not really about pluralism in a kind of multicultural sense as such. Almost that's kind of irrelevant because the decision to attribute meaning to ethnicity, for instance, is a cultural choice. It's not intrinsically meaningful, and there is no intrinsic hierarchy or set of criteria or implications intrinsic to ethnicity or gender or anything else. All of these things ultimately are cultural constructs, at least in my view. I'm an anthropologist in my background. Culture seems to be quite subjective in this sense because, you know, it's very obvious when you go to another country, people see the world slightly differently. So his view would just be the world is simply objectively plural. And so I think that that's simply the fact that it is like that. And we need a political system which allows us to all rub along without actually getting into fights, essentially. How do you create a system with enough leeway in it to allow multiple things to exist? And again, I love analogies. I'm using too many analogies, but I sometimes think of the point of a democracy as kind of like a stent. You know, if you have an artery that's collapsing, you put in that metal wire cage to keep the artery open to allow the blood to flow. In a sense, that democracy is like that. It's a stent to stop an artery collapsing into one person's idea of what the society should be, to allow them all to flow through without conflict and so on. So that's kind of what I mean by plurality. And when you say, you said, I'm a fan of plurality, and I said, yes, I'm technically not actually, because it's not that I think it's good or bad. I simply think it is. It simply is. And we need to start. Too many of the discussions on too many issues these days start from the presumption that there is an answer to the question, is something good or bad? And I'm much more interested in the fact that there are some things simply are, and we just need to work with what there is. Otherwise, we always end up in political battles that have no resolution.
I guess politically, it is a bit of a balancing act because most nations, you know, Canada's an exception. Just to focus on it for a second, because it is fundamentally an immigrant nation. It's a new country. Most countries are much older, and they have a culture that's deeper, more deeply rooted in history than Canada's in terms of time. And in that sense, working with your presentation of pluralism in a society that has an intrinsic culture is a bit more complicated, because you're still referring back to that culture in everyday and in political symbolism and reference. So I suppose it's a bit of a dance and a balancing act to go back and forth between tradition and habits of any country and the ability to engage with this basic reality you're talking about, which is that the world is pluralistic, is a plurality by definition.
Well, I mean, I think that I think within any nation, there's always going to be plurality of perspectives in the politics. There's always my point is less about whether it's an immigrant country or not. Again, I think the meaning we attribute to a country's to immigration itself is rather subjective. But I mean, one thing I would say is kind of tangential, maybe. But I mean, one thing I've been thinking about quite a lot, because I spend a lot of time in Hungary at the moment. And the thing that's interesting with Hungary, or rather the thing I've realized about the Anglosphere, having spent time in Hungary, is the Anglosphere is weird. we live in a weird, the Anglosphere countries are weird for a very particular, and I don't mean weird in the sort of Western educated, individualistic, rational, and whatever the D is. I don't mean that way. It's just weird in the traditional sense of weird, in the sense that we're unusual. Meaning, if you think of the Anglosphere, we're actually a series of island nations. Britain obviously is an island. Australia and New Zealand are islands. North America is basically an island. It's a long way from anywhere. And there's two exceptions to this. There's the Irish border, which is the biggest political flashpoint in British politics. Brexit was all tied up with that. And there's a Mexican border, which of course has been the biggest political flashpoint in North American politics now for at least a decade. But what's interesting is that we are nations with objective borders, meaning that you basically know where the nation ends, even when you're blindfolded, because your feet will get wet. As soon as you hit the ocean, you think the nation's definitely over now. There's no ambiguity. That's the end of it. Most of the world's not like that. I live in Hungary, and the Hungarians like to say that they're the only country in the world surrounded by themselves because historic Hungary was two-thirds bigger, bits of Ukraine, bits of a large part of Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, Croatia were all part of Greater Hungary. But they're not unique to that. Of course, there's many countries in a similar situation. But the point is, when you get to somewhere like Hungary, and indeed most countries in the world, borders are kind of subjective because the populations bleed across the border into one another, which leads to a very different sort of metaphysics. So I think in the Anglosphere, one of the problems is we have this deep metaphysical sense of the world being black and white, here and there, us and them, true or false. It's very easy for us to think in binaries. But actually, most of the world at a deep sort of existential level don't have that experience of the world being quite so binary. They understand that life is a bit more subjective, a bit more open to negotiation. There's need for compromise. There's need for the humility to say we're not quite sure. And I think a lot of the hubris we see in the Anglosphere is probably tied to this sort of attitude we've had, where we've had a sort of the island mentality. But the problem is because we've been so successful as a series of islands in this sense, where the world's dominant culture, everyone else is trapped in a language of response to our frame of reference. And this is why you find Anglosphere people going off to countries like Afghanistan and saying to them, you're wrong, this is right, do this, and just enforce it, and they'll be fine. You'll be just like us. But we're missing the fact that most of the world doesn't have the luxury of knowing where their border ends, in a sense, and the entire metaphysical worldview that comes with that. So my point, I suppose, is less about plurality there. I think the plurality point is more about internally, we just accept there are, we should accept there are a diversity of perspectives because they're not going away. But I do think the Anglosphere in general have this other characteristic, which is very relevant to how they exist in the world.
Well, I think it completely applies to the United States. It has two oceans. It has Canada to the north, and other than 1812, there's never really been an issue between a major political issue between Canada and the United States. And so that does leave the Mexican border, which you mentioned. But that's probably, you're right, that geography has affected the American mission, if you wish, and their attitudes towards the world. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Let me ask you a bit about the United States in a way to see if we can ground our conversation, which has been about ideas more, even though applied in the world, to a practical living situation, which is, let me just capture it by saying, what is the likely future of the United States? I'm asking because a lot of people are concerned. I don't mean just Donald Trump and Joe Biden, by the way. I mean, is, in your view, given your outlooks that you've described to us now, how do you see the United States? Is this a country that is just going through a difficult cycle, a downturn, or is it in permanent decline? Has its historical mission, I mean, I consider it a great political experiment, if you wish. Where is it at? If you have some views on that, including weaving in the ideas you've already expressed.
Well, actually, yeah, I think it's a good place to start from is what we've been talking about. Because do you remember when the Americans left Afghanistan into that 2021, there was that famous image of a man falling from a plane. And I remember when that image was published, people were drawing a comparison saying it's a bookend to 9/11. 9/11, people fell from the buildings, this man fell from the plane. I have to say, it's not I did draw a parallel, but that wasn't the one I was drawing. The one I was drawing was I was thinking that the falling man from the plane made me think of the falling little boy bomb over Hiroshima. Because in a sense, the era of American power and supremacy in the world really began with the falling of that bomb. And it created this, it wasn't just that the bomb fell and started the nuclear age and the American dominance, but also, even though the bombing is morally a difficult issue, it did begin the period of American moral legitimacy, because then they fought against the Japanese, they fought against the Nazis, and then for the next 70 or 80 years, we've lived in this world where there's been this kind of origin myth of the Anglosphere in the United States in the modern era, that we're the plucky underdog who are on the moral side, and we've had that sort of origin myth in a sense for the last 80 years. And it's interesting, as an origin myth, it's one that's been manifested in all the popular stories we like to tell each other and that we sell in the cinemas. All the superhero stories, all the books that have come out that people love, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, all these things, they're all the same story. They're all the story of plucky underdog fighting world-threatening evil who's unambiguously evil and defeats him in the end as a happy ending. And we've been telling that story over and over and again throughout our culture since World War II, at every level, all the way through up until today. It's still the best-selling movies, the best-selling stories, the best-selling books. It's the same story. And that story barely exists in the culture before World War II. There's David and Goliath stories, but Goliath wasn't going to crush the planet. But those stories really emerged after World War II. And it's really interesting that when those men fell from the planes, what it symbolized for me, and the American retreat from Afghanistan symbolized for me, was America basically saying, you know what, we're not even going to keep up the pretense now of moral legitimacy. I mean, they should never have been there, in my view, but the way they left was really showing that there was no deeper principle to the intervention. It wasn't like it was failing, but on fighting the good fight. It's like they stopped fighting the good fight. And what this ended for me was the perception of not just American moral legitimacy, but the perception the Americans actually had the power to do anything in the world, that they wouldn't dare to intervene again. And obviously, within a few months, Russia went into Ukraine, and maybe other wars will start now. And I've had a strong feeling that if World War III starts, or indeed if it's already begun, it will not be an ideological fight between two sides of an ideological battle. What it will be is World War III will be all the old local 20th century conflicts reopening like poorly sutured wounds as the umbrella of American power retreats. So it'll be a lot of localized conflict, Kosovo, maybe Taiwan, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, you name it. Whatever a battle is, India, Pakistan, there'll be something. And it'll be basically where when people realize American power is stretched so thin and they lack the moral legitimacy to maintain things, that then everything opens up again. And so that's kind of where I see things going internationally. But how this links to America is that if you look at what's happened in America the last 80 years, we've had an extraordinary sort of life cycle. The Romans had a word, the saeclium, I think it was, or cyclium, which is the course of human memory, which is 80 years. And it's quite interesting for me, if you look at American culture in general, there's almost nothing in the culture in the West that predates World War II in terms of the general culture we consume. The books we read, if it's before 1945, it's in the classic section. The music before that, we maybe hear it in historical films, but we're not listening to it. All the music we listen to, all the books we read, everything really started in the 1940s and 50s. In fact, you could even make the argument, I think, if you look at what little kids were reading who were born post-war in the early 1950s, they're reading comic books. Those are still the main thing that we're living with today. By the time they were old enough to listen to music, they were creating the music that we can still listen to today in the 60s. By the time they were old enough to be making movies, those are the movies we're still watching since the late 70s. And by the time they were old enough to be US president, they became US president. It's worth noting Clinton was born in August 46, replaced by Bush, born a month before him. Obama is an exception, but he almost was defeated by Hillary Clinton, who's born in 47. Let's assume that for the sake of argument. Trump is then born a month before Bush in June 46, and now the president's born in 42. So we've been locked into the same generation being president from 1992 now until 2029. Within the same bubble, with the exception of Obama, which is quite an exceptional set of circumstances. So it's a really interesting culture that we've been locked into the same generation's culture. And what I feel is that culture has reached a point where it's exhausted itself. It's been I mean, even if you look at the economics of it, in the 1980s, you had the neoliberal period that was quite fresh and new and dynamic. Then in the 90s, the opposition parties simply adopted that position. Labour in the UK, the Democrats in the States, they adopted it wholesale and they sort of canonized it and said that here's the broader theory with some welfare attached. And then in the last 10 years, we've had kind of like almost a zombie version of us trying to reclaim the 1980s glories again. I mean, partly I think Donald Trump's appeal is he's the living embodiment of what a 1980s caricature looks like. Loud, tie, tall, money. He was a big 80s character. And I think people don't talk about it enough. Donald Trump is the embodiment of the good times. And so we're almost trying to recapture that.
Like the movie Wall Street.
Yeah. And so say again, sorry.
Like the movie Wall Street.
Exactly, precisely that. It's exactly what it is. And but my point in what I'm saying here is that, my background's in anthropology, and I feel what we're reaching is the end of an era. And if I can just add one other thing here from anthropology, which is that anthropologists study something called liminal stages. It's the difference is when one era of culture begins to end, and before another one begins, there's often a period of transition. And throughout history, whenever these periods have arrived, there are periods that are notable for all the norms being inverted. Everything that's true becomes false, and so on. It's really interesting if you look across the West right now. All the things we believed in have been inverted. We used to believe experts are now derided. Trump was a bit of a clown character. Now he's, probably two-time US president. If we, J.K. Rowling used to be one of the most loved Brits. Now she's probably the most hated. It used to be that in the 1980s, it was the left and Noam Chomsky writing books like Manufacturing Consent, saying the media is manipulated. It's corporate media that manufactures consent. Now the left are likely to be defending the corporate media and saying the New York Times reports the facts, and it's the right saying it's all fake news. So everything's flipped around. It's really, really interesting. And these are classic signs. These are classic signs of us being in a liminal period where the old culture is declining and before the new culture emerges. But the crucial point is that in liminal stages, liminal stages are things we have in our real lives, like a bar mitzvah is a liminal stage, or a wedding, or indeed going to university. It's that you have your one life, you go to a transition period where everything's inverted, you emerge into your new life. But the difference between liminal stages in our personal lives and liminal stages as complex societies is that in our personal lives, there's always a ceremony master to lead us through the transition, the priests, the rabbi, the university professor, whatever it is. But in complex societies, the entire point is all the usual authorities have lost their nimbus. They no longer have this sort of authority to guide us through anything. So you have this empty space in which charismatic individuals can arise, for better or worse, that can be constructive or destructive. And this is what we're seeing around us. You can see charismatic individuals like Trump, indeed like Greta Thunberg, these sort of charismatic liminars, these edge men, they're known as. And within the space right now, all I can say is for sure is it's clear to me that one era of American culture is ending. There will be a new one that emerges. There's probably going to be some sort of cataclysm in between. But the truth is we can't know what it's going to be. But all we know is the usual sources of power and influence and authority will be completely different. Completely different. And so I think anyone trying to prognosticate and be all I can predict, something's probably going to change. But in terms of if anyone knows what it is, I don't think they can possibly know that.
It's very interesting, this idea about an inversion of everything during this transition period. And I guess it's from the fact that in a way the compass is no longer pointing north. There is no more compass in a way. And then things can go in any direction. Does that make a bit of sense to you in sense of?
That's a great analogy, actually, because it's almost like, the whole idea of compasses is there's magnetic north, right? There's the actual the polarity is there, and but occasionally the Earth's polarity swaps, and in a sense that's what's happening right now, that our compasses are spinning. That we usually had a sense of what was true, and that's gone. One example of this in culture is that when we look back at the 20th century, it looks very divided, right? There's a communist and the capitalist. But in that division, there's actually a massive source of unity that we don't really talk about enough, is that all sides agreed that the best way to understand and indeed act upon the human condition was political economic. So in a sense, they may have disagreed on the answer, but they agreed on the question. The problem we have today in culture, I think, is we no longer know what the question is. So there's a lot of division in society, but people disagree on the question or indeed the problem. And I think that for a very particular reason, because to loosely term, look, I don't really know what left and right means anymore, to be honest. But I think it's fair to say, is a loose general statement, that the difference between the far left and the far right and the center left and the center right is the center left and the center right tended to agree on the problem and disagreed on the solution. So the left would say a bigger state, the right would say a smaller state, you know. The difference between the far left and the far right, whatever these things mean now, is that we disagree not on the answer or the solution, but we disagree on the problem. And the reason we disagree on the problem is we started to think the problem is each other. If I think you're the disease and I'm the cure, and the other way around, there's no source of commonality other than mutual antagonism. And that's one of the problems we face now, is that there is simply no unifying, it's not even narrative. There's you know, when you tell a story, you know, every writer knows a story has at least three acts, right? There's a setup, conflict, and resolution. But in order to have the conflict, communism versus capitalism, you need the setup. You need the starting point of the story. What do we agree on as the problem to be solved? And everyone agreed it was political economic, but there were different solutions to that. Now we have basically conflict without setup, let alone resolution. So we have a de-narrified sort of conflict. And and so I think the great major problem we're facing now is that all the old stories, the old tapestry of stories into which we were all woven like threads, have unraveled, have literally decomposed. They were composed, they have decomposed. And we're left, I think, as a bunch of tangled threads right now. And there's no clear narrative. And what we really need to do is start telling proper stories, not just stories saying the other side are a bunch of idiots and we're the good side, and vice versa. We've got to start telling a story about what are human problems within which we can start to debate what the answers might be. And my suspicion, if you want my sort of one additional thought, my suspicion is if there's one prediction I'm willing to make about what might happen in the future, I think the major source of political division going forward will be between digital and analog. You know, we had the communists and the capitalists debating how much state involvement should there be. So there were some very communist countries, some semi, some not, some socialist and capitalist, right? It's a whole spectrum. I suspect if you cut to 50 years in the future, there'll be a big debate over how analog a country should be. So you'll have maybe not a Soviet Union, you'll have an analog union of countries that have basically gone analog. Countries will say, we vote for parties that say we shouldn't have private computing. Some will say we have them in the offices, but not at home. Some will say we only have it for defense and nothing else. Some will say for none of this. And so I think that's probably the big source of division going forward, is how digital and how analog our country should be. That's my only assumption. The only thing I can...
I think it's a very useful contribution, actually, because most people are arguing whether it's going to be digital West versus digital China. They're thinking in those terms. So I think it's great to reintroduce the notion that actually the split may be between more and more and more digital and a more analog life, period. I think you're onto something there.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think that, I can't really imagine what else it could be, because I mean, every day in my life, you and I are talking online on a computer, and I have my phone charging over here, and I know how much time I've lost the last 10 years staring into that tiny square. And I'm ashamed of how much time I've spent on it. It's the amount of time we spend doing it and the amount of self-loathing we get from having done it, just having spent wasted hours scrolling through, Facebook or something. It's quite a profound impact. And we're always talking about the effect of this stuff on children. It comes a point where these become such going issues politically, where people are worried about what's happening to their kids. Or people are worried about what happens when you have a networked culture which is suddenly subject to a cyber attack, where we lose access to our emails if Gmail's attacked, or we lose access to all our hospital records because it's all on a computer. All we need just one cyber attack where the NHS in England goes down, where all my medical records, which are only held digitally, there is no paper copy of it anyway, only the NHS have it. I don't even have a copy of my medical records. And so all you need is an attack where all that data goes, and that's a threat to my life. Right? Because I need this data to plot what's happened to my health over the years. Potentially, for many people, it's a threat to their lives. And so suddenly you start voting for a party that says, we will make sure that the NHS has a hard copy, that they do it by paper. And we're going to train people at schools in calligraphy again, and organizing libraries. We're going to bring these skills back. And you'd go vote for that party because you see it in your kids, the way they're being with these devices, what they're doing to them. You see it in your medical records, if that data has been lost. And obviously, there's the implication with data that data is control. And so I suspect if there is an analog union, it won't be in the East, the more collectivist cultures, is actually going to be the individualistic West that paradoxically has a big collectivist idea that we will band together to have, some provision of defense against everyone else, but we're going to live in an analog fashion. And it'll be huge. There'll be protests in the streets because some people say, don't take away our devices. We want the digital world. And other people say, we may want it, but it's not worth it, which is exactly what happened with capitalism and communism. Capitalism is great if you can have it. Some people want to hang on to their money. But then the communists said, look, for the greater good, we've got to get rid of it. So it seems to be the natural progress in terms of what happens next.
An analog union. Very interesting. Let's see if it transpires. There's one more notion I wanted to just pick your brain on, which is this term, which I think you mentioned. Rory Stewart had said it, which is we need to have an anthropology of ourselves.
Yeah.
The reason I would like to discuss it with you a bit is because that really speaks to our mission at the Conciliators Guild. The core and basis of what we're doing is try to improve an understanding of human behavior, the kind of, our hinterland of motivations, of perceptions when working in politics. Now, this is something that most people don't touch. They just assume that if I can act politically properly because I am me. We really want to help people understand at the individual and the collective, and they're different, what our patterns are. We have very specific patterns. And I think all that can be kind of summed up in the term a better anthropology of ourselves.
Yeah.
It's great that Rory Stewart has said it regarding Afghanistan. I can certainly vouch for it, frankly, in a million levels. In the work on the Middle East that I've done in bureaucracies, as I mentioned at the beginning, about their inability to really engage with the actual reality in a positive way. And also, it's there's a question really for you is how would that relate to truly living out the pluralism that is an objective reality? What does an anthropology of ourselves look like to you?
Well, it's interesting. I'm actually working on a book. I have been for a few years, very slowly, and I getting distracted. But the book's title is simply Of People. And it seems to me that when we look at ourselves, we really, human life, when you strip it, when you get away from the particular context of anything we do, fundamentally everything we do is about the conflict or the negotiation of two things, our relations and our narrations. That is our relations with each other and the stories we tell. And the example I always give, as a simple example, is, if you have a little boy who's crying, you can really approach that kid in two ways. One is you can approach him and you say, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Now, it doesn't matter if you ever understand what he's feeling. The point is he'll feel better simply by the dint of the fact you gave him the time to listen. We never really understand someone else's inner life, but we don't have to. The knowledge isn't the point. Sometimes simply the listening, the presence is what matters. That's a relationally based relationship where it begins from listening. It begins from giving the person time. And by the way, time is the one great leveler. Time is like the gold standard of human existence. The gold standard was gold was valuable because it was finite, right? And that's why we put value on it. If you think about it, that's what time is, because even Jeff Bezos can't get more time. He doesn't know how much time he's got. He can pay people to go do jobs for him, but he can never actually create more time. And so time is kind of like the gold standard of our lives, and time's expressed relationally. This is why listening is so powerful, because in listening to someone, you're actually sacrificing, you're giving someone a bit of your time, and it has an incredible power to do that. But the alternative way of approaching that little boy is to begin not from the relation, but the narration. And the narration may be, in a given culture, something like, boys don't cry, right? And then you're saying that to that boy, and what he's learning is his actual experience is invalid, and he can't talk about it, but also the person listening isn't willing to give him any time. And there's a very different way of looking at it. And that is really not to listen, but to talk. Is to begin from the narration, saying, boys don't cry, and talk at him, not to listen. And it seems to me that if we talk about an anthropology of ourselves, I think fundamentally we need to really understand much better the effect that narrations have on our relations. And actually, one idea I've been working with is this idea that it's an analogy, but I don't want to sound too sort of abstracted saying this, but it's actually quite simple. Everyone's heard of Einstein's general theory of relativity, right? It's a really simple idea, actually. It's simply that there is a space-time continuum, Mass warps space-time, and warped space-time moves mass. That's all it is. Gravity is just an effect of the warping of space-time by mass. In my view, we live in a relational continuum. We're all connected to each other. And when we drop a narrative onto our relations, it warps it like space-time, and it warps our relationships. So narratives have a warping effect on how we relate to one another, which of course is true, I think, because if you think about it, you and I might get on just fine. But what if we suddenly discover we have very different positions on Israel, Gaza, or Ukraine, Russia, or whatever the issue is we care to talk about? Suddenly it creates a narrational barrier for empathy with the other person. We're preoccupied with the narrative over the relationship. And that's how narratives warp relationships. And all of our relationships are warped in this way. And the anthropological point for me here is that we often ask what led to the emergence of society and so on. Where does complex society come from? And we think, what makes us human? What's special about being human? Sometimes people say language is what makes us special. But language, all creatures have a type of language. It may be a chemical language, it may not be a linguistic one, but it is a language. What we have that's different from everyone else is narrative. And I suspect what happened, we had language and it just metastasized in our brains, and we started thinking not just how do we use language, but what does language mean? And we started doing that. And as soon as we start asking, what is a mountain, instead of saying turn left at the mountain, what is a heap, instead of turn left at the heap, or help me move this heap of sand, as soon as we start doing that, we bewitch ourselves with our words and with narrations. So it seems to me the human story is one of us suddenly becoming bewitched by narration, suddenly creating narrations. And we've been fighting them for 15,000 years probably now. And in a sense, I suspect what led to complex society was we stopped using language as a tool and started to think about, we stopped thinking of language as use, we started to think of it as truth. And to kind of an analogy to explain what I mean here, very quickly, is some people may have seen the video, I think, on YouTube of a gorilla in the forest, or a mirror in the forest, a big mirror, and as animals walk past the mirror. And some of them see themselves in the mirror like an elephant sees itself and goes, oh, it's me. But then there's a gorilla goes past, and the gorilla sees the mirror and he's outraged. He sees another gorilla and he attacks the mirror, and he attacks it several times. He never works out as himself. He's completely baffled by it. Now, for the gorilla, he's confused because he sees another gorilla, because he thinks that mirror isn't a mirror. He thinks it's a window on the world, not a mirror reflecting himself. But we are smarter than the gorilla, and we can see that he has reached the limits of his own cognition. My sense is with language, when we get ourselves bewitched by narrations, it is us looking at language and thinking it's a window on the world. It's actually a mirror of our own limits of our cognition that a higher species perhaps could recognize, but we don't see it. So as a species, we seem to have spent 15,000 years being the gorilla in front of the mirror with our narratives. So if you talk about an anthropology of ourselves, I think we need to recognize the adulterating, the warping effect that of narratives, of narrations on our relations. In a sense, what we need for humanity is a general theory of our relativity, in a sense, of our own relativity, our narrative relativity, maybe. And I think that's what we need, because that's getting away from the petty battles on this issue or that issue. We're all so sucked into these culture wars. What is the framing problem that leads us into all of these silly conflicts, regardless of what the conflict is? I think it's fundamentally we do not understand the effect that our narrations have on our relations. We have no theory of that. And that's what my book is trying to work on. So maybe there is a theory. I don't know if it works, but at a fundamental level, I think that's what we're dealing with.
I think this idea that we're bewitched by our narratives is fantastic. I mean, there are a lot of, I think, other terms as well. I like bewitched.
Well, can I just add one thing on that, which is relevant to that, actually, because I use bewitched advisedly, and I'm glad you like that word, because, we often think that magic doesn't exist. We watch Harry Potter, we think, well, it's all fantasy of the flames coming out of the wand or something, but it's not true. Magic is always spells. It's the casting of spells with words. Well, what is narrative if not magic? Because people have been able to cause millions of people to die by saying words to other people. We bewitch someone with a word and they will die for those words. And what is that if that is not magic? There's no explanation that lies in science or anything. It's not, we don't have to physically do anything. The leaders in the world are not leaders of countries because they are the strongest. They're just the people with the best words, essentially. They're the best casters of spells. And literally, we can't, words are magic. And so it's really interesting when we think magic doesn't exist. Magic is so in front of us, we don't even see it. We're the only species who has this. So we can bewitch people with words. We do. And we not only bewitch others, we have bewitched ourselves constantly. And it's this bewitchment. Wittgenstein had a line of saying, philosophy is about, what was the exact quote? We've long been bewitched by language, and we need to basically unbewitch ourselves, is basically what he was saying. And I think if there's one philosopher everyone should read that's relevant today, it's probably Wittgenstein. But I certainly think that when I say bewitchment, I really mean it. Like words are magic, and we're all wizards in that sense.
Well, yes, and I was going to use other words which completely relate to spells, as you said. It's in a way it can be hypnosis, a state of being completely entranced. It's like the sirens in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
And the only thing I'd also add is we also fall in love with these narratives. And like falling in love, which is, of course, a magical and wonderful state of being, being in love is not really a permanent state. One falls out of love. And the ability to have a proper relation with someone is beyond simply the feeling of being in love. And I think the analogy is there with the wizards who are entrancing us with these narratives. Calum, tremendously rich discussion, a lot of good ideas for thought and reflection. Your thoughts on pluralism, and in your last thoughts, especially, I think, about being bewitched by these narratives, so I hope you complete your book, are especially useful. Thank you for this conversation, and look forward to more. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, John, very much.